Welcome to today's deep dive, where we're going deep into utility regulation.
Specifically in Abu Dhabi.
Right in Abu Dhabi,
We've got some source material
yeah,
on how Abu Dhabi keeps the lights on and the water
keeps
flowing.
the lights in and the water flowing. Some really dense regulatory consultation papers
Yeah, very dense.
covering electricity, water, and wastewater companies.
We'll break it down, though, don't worry.
Yeah, this is the deep dive. That's what we do. We take these dense papers and we distill it down
Yeah.
to what really matters for consumers like you.
We'll be your guides through this complex world of utility regulation.
Yes, so let's start with the basics. Abu Dhabi has a single buyer model for water and electricity. What does that even mean?
Okay, so that means that one entity, ADWEC, buys all the water and electricity from producers.
Okay.
So it's like the big wholesaler in the market.
So all the different producers, instead of them all going out and, trying to sell to consumers, they just sell to ADWE.
That's right.
Okay.
ADW then turns around and sells that to the companies that actually deliver it to your home.
Okay, so the distribution companies?
Yeah, the distribution companies like ADC and ADDC.
Okay, so that's where ADC and ADDC come in.
Yeah.
And so then how did the prices get set up? Because are they just making up numbers?
No, they're not just making up numbers.
Okay.
The prices that ADW charges those distribution companies are determined by something called bulk supply tariffs, or BSTs.
Okay, bulk supply tariffs or BSTs.
But it's not a free-for-all.
Okay.
This whole system is heavily regulated to make sure that things stay fair.
Fair for the companies and fair for me as the consumer.
Exactly.
Okay.
Abu Dhabi uses a hybrid form of what are called revenue caps.
Revenue caps.
So these revenue caps limit how much each company can earn every year,
Okay.
and that puts pressure on them to be more efficient.
Okay. Because if they can't just keep raising prices to, increase their profits, then they have to find other ways to
That's right.
do that.
Exactly. They have to find ways to cut costs and lower their cost.
Okay, so how do they calculate these revenue caps, though? Is there like a secret formula?
There is a formula.
Okay.
It's all about something called maximum allowed revenue, or MAR.
Maximum allowed revenue MAR. Got it.
Okay, and that takes into account several factors like pass-through costs, for example.
Pass-through costs. What are pass-through costs?
So those are costs that the companies don't really control.
Okay.
So like the cost of fuel for power generation, or the cost of buying that initial water and electricity from those producers.
So those are kind of baked into the price from the get-go.
Exactly.
Okay, so pass-through costs, but I'm assuming there's more to it than that.
Yeah, there's more to it. The formula also includes things like the company's operating expenses,
Mm-hmm.
their capital expenditure,
Okay.
and then adjustments based on how well they perform.
So it's not just about passing on these costs, but they have to be efficient and provide good service.
You got it.
Okay. Now, the actual formula for MAR, this maximal allowed revenue, I'm guessing it's a bit complex?
Yeah, it can look a little bit intimidating at first.
Yeah, I'm sure there are variable and adjustments and all sorts of complicated looking things.
There are, but you don't need to know calculus to understand it.
Okay, well, that's good.
The basic idea is that the maximum allowed revenue equals the pass-through costs plus a fixed amount plus some variables based on like how much water or electricity they sell, and then they adjust it for their performance and take away any corrections or penalties.
So they kind of start with like a base and then they
That's right.
add and subtract based on all these different factors.
Exactly.
Okay.
So they have to cover their costs. They need to be able to make a reasonable profit.
Right.
But the prices also need to be fair for consumers.
Right. And so that's where the regulator comes in
Exactly.
to kind of make sure that all this is happening according to the rules.
That's right.
It's a lot more complex than I imagine, but I'm definitely intrigued to see how this all plays out in practice.
Well, in part two, we're going to unpack these price controls and see how they directly affect you as a consumer.
Okay, sounds good. Let's dive deeper. Okay, so we've got this framework for setting prices, this maximum allowed revenue.
Right.
And now let's look at some of the factors that actually go into it.
Okay?
They mentioned something called operating expenditure.
Yes, operating expenditure, or OPEX for short.
X.
This is essentially the cost of running the business.
Okay.
So think salaries, maintenance, administration, all those day-to-day expenses.
Okay, so just to keep the lights on, basically, at the company.
Yeah, to keep the business running.
Okay, so the companies need to cover those costs, right?
Absolutely. But this is where the regulator has to walk a bit of a tightrope.
Okay.
They need to make sure that companies have enough revenue to operate properly.
Right.
But they also want to protect consumers like you from unnecessary price hikes.
Of course. So how do they strike that balance when it comes to OpEx?
Well, one method they use is what's called a top-down approach for projecting these costs.
Top down.
So instead of just accepting whatever figures the companies propose,
Okay.
the regulator actually analyzes historical data, looks at demand growth, and factors in expected efficiency improvements.
So they're basically saying, okay, here's what we think your costs should be based on our analysis.
Yes,
And
exactly.
I'm guessing that that leads to some pushback from the companies?
Sometimes it does.
Yeah.
For example, the consultation paper mentions that some proposed staff cost increases were challenged by the regulator.
Okay.
They essentially said to the companies, hold on, you should be able to find some savings through efficiency initiatives and optimization of resources before you just ask for more money to cover these costs.
That's a good point. It kind of encourages them to be a little bit more careful about their spending.
Exactly, and ultimately that benefits everyone in the long run.
Right, because it could keep prices lower for the consumer.
That's right.
Okay, so we've talked about operating expenses, or OPEX.
Uh-huh.
Let's move on to another big expense, which is capital expenditure.
Capital expenditure, or CapEx.
CapEx.
This is all about investments in infrastructure and assets. So the big ticket items.
So new power plants, water treatment facilities, pipelines, all that kind of stuff.
Exactly, all those big projects.
And I'm assuming those investments can be pretty massive.
Oh yeah, they can be huge.
So how does the regulator scrutinize these mega projects? Because, they want to make sure that they're actually needed and that they're going to benefit consumers.
Right, they don't want companies just spending money for the sake of it.
Right, exactly. So are they involved in every little detail?
Well, for these large-scale projects, there's definitely a lot of scrutiny.
Okay.
They carefully evaluate the need for the project, the projected benefits, and the long-term impact.
Okay.
And they use what's called an ex post approach for CapEx.
Ex post, what does that mean?
It means they grant provisional allowances for these projects initially,
Okay.
but then they review the actual spending later.
So the companies can't just go on a spending spree and hope that it'll all get covered?
That's right. They have to come back and justify all the expenses
Okay.
and demonstrate that they were efficient with their spending.
So there's a real incentive there to stay on budget.
Absolutely. And there could be a financial consequence if they don't.
Okay.
For example, a review of a previous period's CapEx found that some companies were way more efficient than others with their projects.
Okay.
And that led to financial adjustments.
Interesting. So it's really not just about setting the price, but it's also about performance and accountability.
Exactly.
Okay, so OPEX, CAPEX.
Uh-huh.
Now, you mentioned this term earlier, the cost of capital. What is that all about?
The cost of capital is basically the return a company needs to offer to investors to attract the funding they need for these projects.
Okay, so it's kind of the price of money in a way.
You could say that?
And I'm assuming that's a key factor in determining, how much revenue they need to earn.
It is. It's a balancing act, though.
Okay.
You have to balance the needs of the company and its investors with the impact on consumers.
Right. Because I'm assuming if the cost of capital is too high, then that could lead to higher prices for me.
Exactly. But if it's too low, then companies might struggle to attract the investments they need.
To maintain and upgrade the infrastructure.
Exactly. So it's finding that sweet spot.
Okay, so where does Abu Dhabi stand on this whole cost of capital thing?
Well, the regulator actually proposed a real post-tax cost of capital of 4.50% for all the network companies.
4.50%?
Okay, and this was based on their analysis of international benchmarks and local market conditions.
4.5% doesn't sound like a huge return, to be honest.
Well, and that's where the debate comes in.
Okay.
As you might expect, the companies argued for a higher rate of return,
Of course they did.
citing the unique risks of the UAE market.
Right.
So there was a lot of back and forth on this.
Well, what are the potential implications of that? Does it really matter if the cost of capital is 4.5% or, say, 6%?
It absolutely matters. Even a small change can make a big difference.
Okay.
Every percentage point increase in the allowed cost of capital could translate to millions of dirhams in extra revenue for these companies.
Wow.
And that could ultimately get passed on to consumers through higher prices.
Okay, so this seemingly small number can have some pretty big consequences.
That's right.
So I'm starting to see why you said this whole system is so carefully regulated.
It's a complex interplay of financial mechanisms,
Uh-huh.
but it's all designed to strike a balance.
Okay.
But ensuring high performance is another key aspect of this.
Okay.
And that's where the Performance Incentive Scheme, or PIS, comes in.
Okay, so this is kind of like a system of rewards and punishments for the companies?
You could say that?
Okay, so what kind of performance are we talking about? What gets measured?
Well, several factors are taken into account, and they're categorized based on their impact on consumers.
Okay.
The most important ones are what they call the Category A indicators.
Category A.
These include things like network availability,
Okay.
water quality,
Okay.
and customer debt reduction.
So basically keeping the lights on, making sure the water flows from my tap is clean,
Exactly.
and managing customer accounts efficiently.
That's right.
Okay.
And there are specific metrics for each of these things.
Give me an example.
So for network availability, they actually measure something called the
Sci-fi?
System Average Interruption Frequency Index.
Okay, I'm going to take a guess here. Lower sci-fi is better.
You got it.
Okay.
The lower the sci-fi, the fewer interruptions customers experience.
Okay.
And if a company's sci-fi is too high, they can actually face financial penalties.
Ah, so there's a real incentive to keep those outages to a minimum.
There is,
Okay.
and they're also considering adding an indicator specifically for the worst-served customers.
Okay.
So this would target those who are facing repeated interruptions.
So even if they're in, a more challenging area to serve, they
Exactly.
should still get reliable service.
That's right.
Okay, so what about water quality? How do they measure that?
So water quality is assessed based on a whole range of parameters set by the World Health Organization.
Okay.
And that includes things like pH levels, the mineral content, and making sure there are no harmful substances present.
So it's not just making sure the water flows, but making sure it's safe to drink.
Exactly.
Okay, and then there's this customer debt reduction. What's that about?
So this encourages companies to work with customers who might be struggling to pay their bills
Okay.
to present disconnections and make sure everyone has access to these essential services.
It's interesting how all of these performance indicators really do connect back to the consumer experience.
Uh-huh.
It's not just about abstract financial metrics. It's about things that actually affect people's lives.
That's exactly the point.
Okay.
It's about aligning the interests of the company with the needs of the people they serve.
Okay, and it goes beyond just these core indicators, right?
It does. There's also a big focus on something called demand-side management, or DSM.
Demand-side management, DSM.
Yeah, this is all about reducing the peak demand on the system.
Okay.
So that can involve things like encouraging energy efficiency,
Okay.
using smart appliances,
Okay.
and shifting your energy use to off-peak hours.
So instead of building more power plants to meet the growing demand,
Exactly.
you're trying to reduce the demand in the first place.
Exactly. And the PIS actually includes a formula-based incentive to reward companies for success in implementing these DSM programs.
So if they can get people to use less electricity, especially during peak hours,
That's right.
they get rewarded.
Exactly.
And it doesn't stop there, right?
It doesn't?
You said there was more?
They're considering offering incentives for specific DSM projects as well.
Okay.
So really pushing those companies to get creative.
To come up with new ways to reduce that peak demand.
Exactly.
It's really amazing how much thought and detail has gone into all of this.
It is a complex system.
Yeah. But earlier you mentioned something about unexpected twists and financial adjustments.
Right, huh?
That sounds kind of ominous. What did you mean by that? So these financial adjustments, what are those all about?
Well, they're basically a way for the regulator to kind of fine-tune the system.
Okay.
Sometimes things happen that aren't fully captured in that initial price control formula.
Like what? Give me an example.
Okay, so one example involves Transco,
Transco.
the company that transmits electricity across the Eminent.
Okay.
They experienced delays in installing meters that comply with MDI standards.
MDX standards. What are those?
Those are essentially guidelines for energy efficiency and data management.
Okay, so they were behind schedule on that.
Right, and because of those delays,
Okay.
the regulator imposed a negative adjustment to their allowed revenue.
So they got penalized financially.
Exactly. It highlights that meeting deadlines and implementing new technologies is really important.
Right, because there are financial consequences if you don't.
That's right.
Okay, so they're not just letting companies off the hook if they don't perform.
Accountability is really key in this whole system.
Okay.
Here's another example.
Okay.
AADC, one of the distribution companies,
Uh-huh.
they were given an allowance for a specific operating expense,
Okay.
but they failed to provide adequate information about how they were actually using that allowance.
So they weren't very transparent about their spending.
Exactly.
And what happened?
The regulator removed the allowance completely.
Wow.
So that shows that transparency is really important.
Yeah, you got to be able to justify your expenses.
That's right.
Or you risk losing those allowances.
Exactly.
Transparency and accountability, they seem to be recurring themes.
They really are.
Okay. And are these financial adjustments always backward-looking, or do they sometimes look forward?
Well, sometimes they're used to incentivize future improvements.
Okay, how so?
For example, the regulator is considering a potential negative adjustment
Uh-huh.
to both ADC and ADDC
Okay.
related to the implementation of GS standards.
GS standards, fill me in.
These are globally recognized standards
Uh-huh.
for water and electricity infrastructure and service quality.
Okay.
They cover a wide range of technical specifications and operational practices.
Okay, and so the regulator's saying implement these standards or else.
Yeah, basically, it's a way to push those companies to improve.
Okay, and make sure that Abu Dhabi's utility sector remains world-class.
Exactly.
So it's interesting how these adjustments can be used both as a reward and as a punishment.
That's right. It's all part of this dynamic framework.
Right, it's not just a static set of rules.
Exactly. It needs to evolve to keep up with the changing times.
This has been incredibly insightful. I feel like I've learned so much about how this whole system works.
It is a complex system.
It is, but you've explained it so well.
Well, I'm glad you found it helpful.
Yeah, I definitely have a much better understanding now.
And hopefully you can see how it all directly affects you as a consumer.
Oh, absolutely. I don't think I'll ever look at my water bill or electricity bill the same way again.
That's what we like to hear.
Well, thanks again for joining me on this deep dive. It's been a pleasure.
The pleasure was all mine. Until next time.